7 miles down, in water so black sunlight has never touched it. A creature the size of your thumb is swimming through pure poison. Its body is soaked in chemicals that were banned before your parents were born. And here's the part that should stop you. This animal, in the most remote place on Earth, is more contaminated than creatures pulled from one of the filthiest rivers on the planet. No factory dumped it here. No pipe leaks nearby. So how did the deepest, loneliest point on Earth become one of the most toxic? The answer is worse than pollution. Picture the deepest place you can imagine. Not a cave. Not a mine shaft. Deeper. Keep going down past the point where light quits, past the point where the water above you presses down with the weight of a small mountain, until you reach a floor no sunlight has ever touched, and no human eye has ever seen without a machine to carry it there. That is where this story ends up. And before we even arrive, you already believe something about that place that turns out to be wrong. You believe it's clean. It's a reasonable thing to believe. When we think about pollution, we picture the places crowded with people. A river running black past a factory. A shoreline stitched with plastic. Air you can taste. Pollution feels like something that lives where we live, close to the machines, and the pipes, and the crowds that make it. So the logic runs backward without us noticing. If pollution is where people are, then the places without people must be the clean ones. And there is no place on Earth with fewer people than the bottom of the ocean. 7 miles of water sit between the surface and the deepest trenches. No one lives there. Nothing we build survives there for long. The pressure alone would crush a submarine designed for anywhere shallower. For most of human history, we couldn't reach it at all. And even now, only a handful of people ever have. If any place on this planet should have stayed untouched, sealed off, forgotten, it's that one. That's the picture almost everyone carries. The deep sea as wilderness, the last pure place. A dark, cold, empty room at the bottom of the world that we've barely opened the door on. Hold on to that picture. We're about to take it apart. Here's the first crack in it. The deep sea is not empty, and it was never sealed. It's the opposite. It's connected to everything above it by a single, quiet, unstoppable process. Things fall. That's it. That's the whole mechanism, and it's far more powerful than it sounds. Every ocean on Earth is constantly raining. Not water, but material. Dead plankton, scraps of animals, fecal pellets, dust. The remains of everything that lived and died in the sunlit water near the surface drift down, slowly, endlessly, in a steady fall that scientists actually call marine snow. It looks like snow. It drifts like snow. Catch it in the beam of a deep-sea light, and it even glows like snow caught in a headlight. And it never stops. Now follow that where it leads. If everything that dies near the surface eventually sinks, then the deep sea isn't a sealed room at all. It's a floor. It's the place where the entire ocean above finally sets its things down. And a floor doesn't stay clean just because nobody walks on it. A floor collects whatever falls onto it. That's the reversal. And it changes the whole question. We started by asking how something so remote could be dirty. Wrong question. The remoteness was never protection. Being far from people doesn't mean being cut off from what people make. It just means being downstream of it. And in the ocean, down is a direction everything eventually travels. It gets stranger than a floor, though, because the deepest places aren't flat. They're shaped exactly wrong for staying clean. Think about the geography for a second. The deep ocean isn't one even plane. It has mountains, ridges, vast rolling abyssal fields. And then, in a few narrow places, it has trenches. Trenches are the deepest gouges in the planet's surface. Canyons plunging miles below the surrounding seafloor. Dark slots so far down that the water pressure inside them is beyond anything a human body could survive for even a second. The Mariana Trench is the deepest of them all. And a trench doesn't just collect what falls straight onto it, it funnels. Material that lands on the slopes above can slide, slump, and tumble down toward the bottom. The trench sits at the low point of everything around it, gathering not only its own share of the falling snow, but the runoff of a much wider area, all of it working its way toward one narrow line at the very bottom. So here's where we've arrived. The deepest place on Earth is not a sealed vault, it's a drain. It's the single lowest point in a system that spends every second of every day moving material downward. Whatever ends up in the ocean, given enough time, has a path that leads here. And that changes what remote even means. We use that word to mean safe, untouched, apart from us. But for a trench, remote doesn't mean disconnected. It means final. It's remote the way the bottom of a well is remote, hard to reach, easy to fill, and impossible for anything to climb back out of on its own. Now hold that thought against what actually falls. For most of the planet's history, what rained into the deep was natural, dead things. The ordinary debris of a living ocean. The system had been running that way for millions of years, and the animals down there evolved to live off exactly that slow, thin, unpredictable rain of food from above. But somewhere in the last 100 years, the material falling into that ocean changed. We started adding things to the water that had never existed before. Chemicals built in factories. Compounds designed to be tough, to resist heat, to never break down. And the ocean did with them exactly what it does with everything else. It carried them down. This is the part that should make you uneasy. And I want to be careful, because the honest version is stranger than the scary version. Nobody drove a truck to the Mariana Trench and dumped poison into it. There's no secret pipe, no midnight barge, no villain standing over the deepest hole on Earth. That's what makes it worse. The contamination in the deepest place on the planet didn't arrive through some dramatic act. It arrived through the ocean simply doing what it has always done, collecting what falls, while we quietly changed what was falling. The trench didn't fail to protect itself. It worked perfectly. It just happened to be catching the wrong thing. And for a long time, we had no idea. We assumed the depth itself was a kind of shield. Too far, too dark, too hard to reach for our mess to matter down there. It's the same instinct that lets any of us throw something away and stop thinking about it. Out of sight, gone. The deep sea was the ultimate out of sight. If it was contaminated at all, surely it would be trace levels, faint echoes of a distant world, nothing next to the poisoned rivers and harbors where the pollution actually came from. That assumption held right up until someone decided to check. Because you can't measure the deep sea by looking at it. You can't lower a jar 7 miles down and read the water. The kind of contamination we're talking about doesn't even dissolve into the water in the first place. That turns out to be central to the whole problem, and we'll get to exactly why. To find out what was really down there, scientists needed something living. Something that spent its entire existence in that black water, eating whatever fell, storing whatever it ate. A body that had been quietly recording the truth of that place for its whole life. There was such a creature, small, pale, easy to overlook. It lives at depths that would kill almost anything else, and it swarms out of the dark in the thousands whenever food arrives. It had been down there the whole time, soaking up the answer to a question nobody had thought to ask. When researchers finally brought some of these animals up and looked inside them, the numbers didn't just confirm that the deep sea was a little dirty. They broke the entire idea of the deep sea as a clean place. What was sitting in the tissue of these tiny scavengers should not have been possible for somewhere so far from us. And that's where this stops being a story about a faraway trench and becomes a story about a single small animal that had been carrying the evidence all along. The animal is called an amphipod. If you've ever flipped over a rock at the beach and watched little curved shrimp-like things scatter, you've seen its cousins. They're crustaceans, distant relatives of crabs and lobsters and the shrimp on your plate, and most of them are small, unremarkable, the kind of creature you'd step over without a second look. There is nothing about an amphipod that suggests it's about to tell you something disturbing about the entire planet. But the ones living in the deepest trenches are a particular kind. And the particular kind matters. The species pulled from the bottom of the Mariana Trench is called Hirondellea gigas. It's a scavenger, maybe a couple of centimeters long, pale and translucent, built for a world where food almost never comes. And when researchers wanted to know what was really sitting at the bottom of the deepest place on Earth, this was the animal they went looking for. Not because it's impressive, because of what it does for a living. Here's the problem they were trying to solve. You cannot sample the deep trench the way you test a river. Down there, the pollutants we care about don't float freely in the water for you to scoop up and measure. They're barely in the water at all, so testing the water would tell you almost nothing. You'd lower your instruments 7 miles into the dark, pull them back up, and read numbers that looked reassuringly low. The poison isn't dissolved in the water, it's hiding somewhere else. It's hiding in the animals. That's the trick. And it's the reason a 2-centimeter scavenger became the most honest witness on the planet. To understand why, you need to know what these chemicals do when they get into a body, and specifically where they go. They chase fat. The compounds we're talking about are the kind that refuse to mix with water but dissolve easily into oils and fats. So the moment one of them enters a living thing, it doesn't pass through and wash out. It buries itself in the fatty tissue and stays. Every time the animal eats something carrying even a trace of these chemicals, a little more gets locked away in its body, and almost none of it leaves. Do you see what that makes the animal? A recorder, a living archive. Every meal it has ever eaten leaves a chemical signature stored in its own flesh. And because these compounds don't break down and don't wash out, that record only ever grows. The amphipod isn't just exposed to the contamination of the trench, it concentrates it. It takes the faint, spread-out traces drifting down from far away and gathers them, meal after meal, into its own small body, until the level inside the animal is far higher than the level in the water around it. Which means that if you want to know how contaminated a place truly is, you don't ask the water. You ask the thing that's been eating there its whole life. So they went and got some. The method itself is worth picturing, because it tells you how hard this place is to reach. You can't send a diver. You can't easily send a crewed submarine to the very bottom of the Mariana Trench. Almost no vehicle on Earth can go that deep and come back. So instead they use what's called a lander, a free-falling frame of instruments and bait, dropped from a ship on the surface, left to sink under its own weight for hours through the darkening water until it settles on the trench floor miles below. The bait sits there in the black. And out of the dark, drawn by the smell of food, in a place where food is desperately rare, the amphipods come. They swarm. In a world where a meal might arrive once in a very long while, the arrival of anything edible triggers a feeding frenzy of thousands. The lander catches some of them, then releases its weights and floats back up to the surface, carrying its passengers up through all 7 miles of water into the light. And then, in the lab, they measured what was inside those bodies. This is where I have to be honest about the exact numbers, because the honesty is the whole point of this kind of story. Different reports of this work have described the contamination in slightly different ways, and I'm not going to hand you a single tidy figure and pretend it's carved in stone. What the measurements showed was a level of one class of banned industrial chemicals inside these deep trench amphipods that was extraordinarily high, in some comparisons reported as many times greater than what's found in creatures living in the estuaries of some of the most polluted rivers on the planet. Rivers that run past factories, rivers thick with industrial history, the kind of water you would never swim in. Sit with that comparison, because it's the entire promise of this story landing all at once. On one side, a river choked by human industry, a place we already know is filthy, a place nobody would call clean. On the other side, the single most remote body of water on Earth, 7 miles down, nowhere near a factory or a pipe or a city. And the creature from the remote place is carrying more of this contamination in its body than the creature from the poisoned river. The first reaction most people have is that this must be a mistake. It can't be right that the untouched place beats the polluted place. And that reaction is exactly the assumption this whole story exists to break. It isn't a mistake. It's a mechanism. And the mechanism is the thing we started uncovering in the last stretch. The trench as a drain, the endless downward fall, the funnel that gathers instead of flushing. The river is dirty because industry pours into it. The trench is dirty because everything the ocean carries, given enough time, ends up at its bottom and has nowhere else to go. But notice what the amphipod adds to that picture, because it's a second, sharper twist. It's not just that the trench collects contamination. It's that the animals living there take whatever contamination reaches them and pack it tighter. The water at the bottom of the trench, if you measured it directly, might not look alarming at all. The alarm is in the bodies. The living things are doing the concentrating. They're taking a thin, diffuse signal and amplifying it into something you can't ignore, which is why the amphipod, and not the water, was the one that finally told the truth. There's something almost unsettling about that when you slow down and think about it. This animal spent its entire life doing nothing wrong. It ate what fell, the way its ancestors had eaten what fell for millions of years. It has no idea that some of what's been drifting down is different now. It just kept doing the one thing it's built to do: gather the scraps of the world above. And in doing so, it became a container for our chemical history. It didn't choose to record us. It couldn't help it. Its own biology, the same fat-storing chemistry that lets it survive the long, hungry stretches between meals, is exactly what turned it into evidence. And here's the open question that pulls us forward, the one the numbers raise, but don't answer. We know now what these animals are carrying. We can name the broad category of chemicals, and we can say the levels are high, but we still haven't asked the most obvious thing. What actually is this stuff? What are these compounds that can drift into the deepest place on Earth, resist everything the ocean does to break things down, and still be intact and dangerous inside a living body decades after we stopped making them? Because that's the detail that makes the trench so difficult to clean and so easy to poison. These aren't ordinary chemicals that fade with time. They were engineered, deliberately, cleverly, to survive. We built them to resist heat, to resist breakdown, to last. And we succeeded so completely that they're now doing something we never designed them for, outliving their own ban. In the body of an animal at the bottom of the world. To understand how the trench became this contaminated, you have to understand what kind of poison refuses to die. They have a name, and the name itself tells you the problem. Persistent organic pollutants. Scientists shorten it to POPs, but don't let the tidy little acronym soften it, because the first word is doing all the work. Persistent. It means these chemicals do not go away. Not in years. Not in decades. Sometimes not in a human lifetime. Everything else that falls into the ocean eventually gets taken apart, eaten, rotted, broken down by bacteria and sunlight and time until it becomes something else. These don't. They were built specifically so that they wouldn't. And that single quality, engineered on purpose in a factory, is the reason the deepest place on Earth can't keep itself clean. Two families of these chemicals matter most for our story. The first is a group called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Forget the chemistry name for a moment and think about what they were for, because it explains everything. PCBs were miracle chemicals. For decades in the 20th century, they were exactly what industry dreamed of. Stable, oily liquids that didn't catch fire easily, didn't break down under heat, didn't conduct electricity, and stayed chemically calm under conditions that would wreck ordinary substances. So we put them everywhere. In electrical transformers, in the fluid inside industrial equipment, in coatings, in sealants, in the paint on ships' hulls to stop barnacles from growing. Anywhere you needed a substance that would just endure heat, pressure, time, abuse, PCBs were the answer. They were prized precisely because nothing could touch them. And here is the trap, the reversal hiding inside a success story. The exact property that made PCBs so useful is the property that makes them so dangerous now. We wanted a chemical that nothing could break down. We got one. We just didn't think through the second half of that sentence. A chemical that nothing can break down is a chemical that never leaves. Once it's out in the world, it doesn't degrade, doesn't dissolve away, doesn't quietly disappear the way we imagine our waste eventually does. It stays. It stays and it moves, drifting through water and air and living bodies, still intact, still doing what it does, long after anyone remembers making it. The second family is called PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and their story rhymes with the first. These were flame retardants. For years, they were mixed into plastics, furniture foam, electronics, all sorts of everyday things to make them harder to set on fire. A reasonable goal. Nobody wants their couch bursting into flame. But like the PCBs, these compounds were built to be tough and stable. And toughness in a chemical means it doesn't break down when you're finished with it. It just goes out into the world and persists. Now here's the detail that makes this story land, because it's the kind of thing people assume solves the problem, and it doesn't. Many of these chemicals have been banned. PCBs were restricted decades ago in country after country once the danger became clear. Banned in much of the world since the late 1970s. The flame retardants have been getting phased out more recently, so the natural thought is fine. We made a mistake, we stopped, problem over. Ban the poison, and the poison goes away. Except that's not how persistence works. That's the whole cruelty of the word. A ban stops new production. It does absolutely nothing to the mountains of the stuff already made, already in use, already leaking out of old equipment and dumped in old landfills and washing off into rivers and out to sea. We stopped making PCBs before a lot of people watching this were born. It doesn't matter. The PCBs from back then are still here. They're in the soil, in the water, in the fat of animals across the entire planet. And as we now know, in the body of a scavenger at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Banning them was the right thing to do. It just wasn't a delete button. There isn't a delete button. That's the point of a persistent chemical. You can stop adding to the pile, but the pile itself is close to permanent. So picture the timeline the way the amphipod experiences it. A chemical is made in a factory sometime in the middle of the last century. It's used, discarded, banned, forgotten. The people who made it retire and die. Whole industries that relied on it vanish. And that chemical, that specific molecule, is still out there the entire time. Intact, unchanged, patient, until one day it drifts down through 7 miles of ocean and settles into the tissue of an animal that will never know what it is. The ban is a footnote from the amphipod's point of view. The molecule doesn't care that we changed our minds. There's one more property of these chemicals that you need, because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. I mentioned it before, and now it matters completely. These compounds hate water. In the language of chemistry, they're hydrophobic, water-fearing. Drop them into the ocean, and they will not dissolve and spread out evenly the way salt or sugar would. They do the opposite. They flee the water. They cling to anything solid they can find. A particle of sinking debris, a scrap of dead plankton, a fleck of plastic, the fatty tissue of a living body. Anything but the water itself. Slow down on that because it quietly explains two mysteries at once. First, it explains why you can't just test the water to find these chemicals. They're not really in the water in any meaningful amount. They're stuck to the stuff drifting through it and buried in the bodies swimming through it. And second, it explains how they travel down. If these compounds refused to leave the water, they'd stay near the surface, spread thin across the whole ocean, mostly harmless. But they don't stay in the water. They grab onto sinking particles and ride them down. Every scrap of falling debris in that endless marine snow can become a tiny elevator, carrying a persistent, unbreakable molecule from the sunlit surface toward the dark. Water goes everywhere and dilutes. These chemicals do the opposite. They attach, they concentrate, they sink. Put the two properties together and you have a nightmare built for the deep sea specifically. A chemical that never breaks down, so time can't erase it, and a chemical that refuses to stay in the water, so it hitches a ride on everything that falls. Persistence gives it forever. Water hatred gives it a direction, and the direction is down. This is why the trench can't win. Sunlight might slowly break some pollutants apart at the surface, but there's no sunlight in the deep. Warmth speeds up chemical breakdown, but the trench is near freezing. The very conditions of the deep sea, dark, cold, still, cut off from the forces that break things down up in the light, are the perfect conditions for a persistent chemical to stay persistent. If you were designing a place to preserve an indestructible poison for as long as physically possible, you would design the bottom of a trench, cold storage, a freezer at the bottom of the world, where the one thing that keeps arriving is the one thing that will never leave. So we've named the enemy now. Not some exotic deep-sea toxin. Chemicals we made ourselves on purpose, because they were useful, and made so well that they outlived their own usefulness and their own ban, and are now sitting intact in the deepest tissue of the deepest animal in the deepest place we know. But naming the poison and explaining why it lasts forever still leaves the hardest question standing. Persistence tells you why it stays once it arrives. Water hatred tells you it likes to sink. Neither one actually tells you how a molecule makes the full journey, from a factory or a landfill on land, out across the ocean, and all the way down through 7 vertical miles of water to a trench floor almost no light or vehicle has ever reached. That's not a small trip, that's the longest fall on Earth. So how does it actually get there? What carries it down? It falls as snow. I know how that sounds, but it's the closest thing to the truth. And once you can picture it, the whole journey stops being mysterious. Turn a bright light on in the deep ocean, and you'll see it. A constant drifting fall of pale flecks moving downward through the black, thick enough in places to look like a snowstorm caught in headlights. It never melts, and it never stops. Scientists call it marine snow, and it is the single most important thing happening in the deep sea because it's the reason anything down there is alive at all. And as it turns out, the reason anything down there is poisoned. Here's what the snow actually is. Up near the surface, in the thin sunlit layer where the ocean is alive and crowded, things are constantly dying. Plankton bloom and die by the trillions. Fish leave scraps. Everything that eats produces waste. All of that organic material, dead cells, broken bodies, fecal pellets, mucus, dust, starts to clump together and sink. As it falls, more sticks to it. It drifts down slowly, sometimes taking days or weeks to reach the bottom. and along the way it becomes the food supply for an entire hidden world. The deep sea grows almost nothing of its own. It has no sunlight, so it has no plants, so it makes no food. Everything living down there is living on leftovers from above. The whole dark ecosystem, all the way down to the trench floor, is fed by this slow rain of the dead. Now bring back the chemicals from the last stretch and watch what happens when the two things meet. Remember what these persistent pollutants do? They hate water and they cling to anything solid. So picture a single molecule of a banned chemical drifting somewhere in the upper ocean, refusing to dissolve, looking for something to grab onto. And here comes the marine snow. Endless falling particles of exactly the kind of oily, organic material these chemicals love to stick to. The molecule attaches. And the moment it does, it stops being a thing suspended in water and becomes a passenger on something that is heading straight down. That's the elevator. That's the whole delivery system. The ocean is running a conveyor belt from the surface to the deepest floor, powered by gravity and death. And these chemicals have learned to ride it. They don't need a pipe. They don't need someone to carry them. They just need to touch a falling particle. And the ocean does the rest. Marine snow was always going to carry food down to the deep. Now it carries poison down with it, and it can't tell the difference. To the amphipod waiting at the bottom, they arrive as the same thing. A scrap of food with a molecule of banned industrial chemical riding along, indistinguishable from a scrap of food that's clean. It eats both. And there's a second passenger on that elevator, one that makes this worse and more modern at the same time. Plastic. When plastic gets into the ocean and breaks down, it doesn't vanish. It shatters into smaller and smaller fragments until it's drifting through the water as tiny particles. And plastic, it turns out, is one of the things these water-hating chemicals cling to most eagerly. A fleck of plastic in the ocean acts like a magnet for persistent pollutants. It gathers them onto its surface, concentrating them, and then, because plastic sinks too, it carries that concentrated dose down into the deep. So a single piece of plastic isn't just litter drifting in the water, it's a delivery truck. It picks up poison at the surface, holds it, and drives it to the bottom. The plastic is a problem on its own, but it's also a vehicle for an older problem, ferrying decades-old banned chemicals down into a place they could never have reached so efficiently on their own. Stop and notice the shape of what we've built here, because it's almost too neat. We made chemicals that never break down. We made plastic that never really goes away. And the ocean, entirely on its own, connected the two into a system that carries both of them together to the one place on Earth they can never be retrieved from. Nobody designed that. It assembled itself out of our leftovers and the ocean's oldest habit. Now, you might reasonably expect that this journey would weaken the problem. 7 miles is a long way down. The ocean is unimaginably vast. Surely over that enormous distance and that enormous volume of water, the contamination would spread out and thin to almost nothing by the time it reached the bottom. Dilution. That's how we usually imagine the ocean handling our waste. It's so big that whatever we put in gets swallowed and scattered until it hardly matters. Dump something into an ocean this size, and it should disappear into the sheer scale of the water. For a lot of pollution, that's roughly true near the surface. But for these chemicals, riding these particles, sinking into this kind of place, dilution is exactly the wrong expectation. And understanding why is the hinge between everything we've covered and everything that's coming. Here's the flaw in the dilution idea. Dilution needs space and movement. It needs somewhere for the contamination to spread out into and currents to keep mixing it thinner and thinner. The open surface ocean has that vast horizontal room, constant mixing, water flowing in every direction. But the marine snow isn't spreading outward. It's falling. It's collapsing everything downward onto a smaller and smaller target. The material that was spread across a wide patch of surface water all drifts shortest down toward the low ground beneath it. Instead of spreading the contamination out, the falling snow gathers it in, funneling the pollution from a large area up top onto a narrow strip of floor far below. And the narrowest, lowest strip of floor in the entire ocean is a trench. So the geography does the opposite of what we assumed. We pictured the depth as distance, as protection, as room for the poison to fade. But depth here isn't a buffer, it's a slope. Everything that falls toward a trench doesn't scatter across the deep. It slides toward the deepest line and concentrates there. The wide surface funnels into the narrow bottom. The vastness of the ocean, which we imagined would dilute the problem, actually feeds it, because a huge area of falling contamination collects into one small place at the very bottom. This is the moment the title stops sounding like a trick. A polluted river is dirty in an obvious way. Pollution goes in, and it's right there, concentrated, undeniable. We look at a black river, and we understand it instantly. The deep trench is dirty in a way that hides from us, because the contamination arrives invisibly, one falling particle at a time, from a source thousands of miles wide, and a surface we can't watch. We never see it happen. There's no moment of pollution, no visible dumping, nothing to photograph, just a quiet, endless snow, carrying the residue of an entire industrial civilization down to a place we assumed was too far away to reach. But we still haven't answered the sharpest version of the question. We know the poison travels down. We know it rides the snow and the plastic. We know the falling material funnels toward the trench instead of spreading out. That explains how contamination gets there and why it arrives concentrated rather than diluted. It does not explain why it stays. Plenty of places in the ocean receive marine snow. Plenty of the seafloor gets a steady fall of debris. Why does the trench, specifically, become more contaminated than almost anywhere else, more by some measures than a poisoned river? Why doesn't it simply pass through or wash away, or reach some balance and stop climbing? The answer is in the shape of the trench itself, because a trench doesn't just collect what falls into it. A trench is a place things can get into and never get back out of. Think about a river again, because the contrast is the whole answer, and it's simpler than you'd expect. A river is dirty, yes, but a river is also always leaving. That's what a river is. Water in motion, running downhill, heading somewhere. Whatever pollution goes into it doesn't just sit there. It gets carried along downstream, out toward the sea, and eventually into the vast open ocean where it spreads and thins. A river is filthy and moving at the same time. Pour poison in at the top, and the river is constantly, relentlessly flushing it out the bottom. The contamination is real, but it's also passing through. The river never gets to keep it. Motion won't let it. That constant flushing is the thing we don't usually notice, and it turns out to be a kind of mercy. The filth of a river is also the river's escape route. Everything bad that enters it is on its way out almost as soon as it arrives. The river is dirty because it's a channel, and being a channel means the dirt keeps moving on. Now look at the trench and take away the one thing the river had. Take away the motion. A trench is the opposite of a river in the way that matters most. It isn't a channel leading somewhere. It's a dead end. It's the lowest point in the entire region, a deep slot in the seafloor with nothing below it, and nowhere lower for anything to go. Whatever falls in doesn't get flushed downstream because there is no downstream. There's no current running through it to carry things out. The water at the bottom of a trench is old, cold, and still, cut off from the restless mixing of the ocean above. Things arrive, and then they stop. The trench receives and receives and receives and never sends anything back. That's the reversal that makes the whole title true. The river and the trench can both be contaminated. But the river is a place pollution passes through, and the trench is a place pollution ends. One is a hallway. The other is a room with no exit. And if you keep feeding a room that has no exit, quietly, endlessly, one falling particle at a time, the amount inside it can only ever go up. There's a phrase for what this makes the trench, and it's worth saying plainly. It's a sink. Not the metaphor of a kitchen sink, though that image isn't wrong. In environmental science, a sink is the place where something ends up and accumulates, the destination at the bottom of a process. Rivers are transporters. The surface ocean is a mixer. The trench is a sink, the final resting place, the drain at the bottom of the whole system, where the things that never break down go to sit forever, joined constantly by more of themselves. And now stack the properties we've been building, because this is where they all lock together into something inescapable. The chemicals never break down, so time can't reduce them. They cling to sinking particles, so they get delivered downward instead of drifting away. The falling snow funnels toward the low ground, so a wide surface concentrates onto a narrow floor, and the trench has no outflow, so nothing that arrives can ever leave. Each of those on its own is a problem. Together, they're a machine with no off switch. Delivery in, no removal out, no breakdown, no escape. The level at the bottom has only one direction it can go, and it goes there for as long as we keep making the stuff. This is why a place with no factories can out-poison a river lined with them. The river has the pollution and the exit. The trench has only the entrance. There's a detail above the trench that makes the delivery even more efficient. And it's worth picturing because it's one of those things that sounds like it should help and does the opposite. The waters over the Western Pacific, over the Mariana Trench, are part of a vast system of swirling ocean currents, a gyre, a slow, rotating whirl of water thousands of miles across. When you first hear that, you might think a huge swirling current would sweep contamination away, spread it out, keep it moving. That's the instinct. Currents carry things off. But researchers who studied this contamination have suspected something less comforting. A gyre doesn't only push things outward. A great rotating system of water can also draw floating material inward and downward, gathering surface debris and drift toward its center and pulling it into the deep. The current that looks like it should be carrying material away might instead be helping funnel it down toward the trench below. The very motion we imagine as an escape route could be part of the delivery system. That connection isn't fully nailed down. It's an inference about how the surface currents and the deep trench relate. Geese and honest scientists hold it as a strong suspicion rather than a closed case. But the shape of it fits everything else. Everything about this place seems arranged to bring material in and keep it. And there are two more suspected reasons this particular trench carries such a heavy load, both of them still in the realm of informed suspicion rather than proof. One is proximity. The Mariana Trench sits in a part of the world not far, in ocean terms, from enormous industrial activity, from major manufacturing, from the kind of large-scale plastic production that feeds pollution into the sea. The other is more specific. There's a long-standing military presence on the nearby island of Guam, and researchers have wondered whether that too has contributed to the local chemical burden over the decades. Neither of these is a proven smoking gun. They're the kind of thing scientists point to and say, this fits, this is plausible, this may be part of the picture. Keep them as suspicions. But notice that they all point the same way, toward a trench that sits downstream in every sense of a great deal of human activity, with no way to flush any of it back out. Here's what I want you to really feel, though, because the numbers and the mechanisms can start to blur into something abstract. And this part isn't abstract at all. Everything we've described has been happening for decades, silently, with no one watching. Every day since the middle of the last century, the snow has kept falling. Every day, some fraction of it has carried a molecule of something that will never break down. Every day, that molecule has ridden down into a place it can never leave, and joined the ones that arrived the day before, and the year before, and the decade before. There's been no dramatic event, no spill, no disaster, no moment you could point to. Just an unbroken, patient accumulation in the dark, going on the entire time. The level at the bottom creeping upward while the world above forgot the deep sea existed. That's a genuinely unsettling thing to sit with. We tend to imagine environmental damage as events: the oil spill, the burning river, the visible catastrophe. This is the other kind, the kind with no event at all. Just a mechanism, running quietly, correctly, for longer than most of us have been alive, doing exactly what its physics demands. The trench didn't get poisoned in a moment. It got poisoned by time. So now we understand the place. We understand why the deepest point on Earth is a sink and not a sanctuary. Why depth concentrates instead of dilutes. Why a room with no exit fills up while a river flushes clean. And why the honest comparison in the title isn't hype. The trench collects what the whole ocean sheds and it never lets go. But a sink is just a container. It explains the water, the sediment, the environment. It doesn't yet explain the thing that shocked everyone in the first place: the animal. Because the contamination in the amphipod's body was higher than the contamination in the trench around it. The place is a sink, yes, but the creatures living in that place are doing something more than sitting in polluted water. They're taking whatever reaches them and making it worse, concentrating it inside their own bodies until a tiny scavenger becomes more toxic than the water it swims in. To understand that, we have to look at what it takes to stay alive down there, and why survival itself, in a place this starved, turns an animal into a trap for poison. Imagine being hungry almost all the time. Not hungry the way you get before dinner. Hungry as a permanent condition. Hungry as the baseline of your entire existence, broken only rarely, unpredictably, when something finally falls out of the dark and lands near you. That is life at the bottom of the trench. And that hunger, not the pressure, not the cold, not the darkness, is what turns these animals into concentrators of poison. To understand the contamination in the amphipod, you have to understand the starvation it lives with. Go back to the marine snow. It feeds the entire deep sea, yes, but by the time it has fallen 7 miles, most of it is gone. Every layer of the ocean on the way down is full of hungry things intercepting that falling food, eating it, taking their share, so that what finally reaches the very bottom is the thin remainder of a remainder. The scraps of the scraps. The deepest trench floor is one of the most food-poor environments on the planet. The animals living there are surviving on almost nothing, in near total famine, waiting for a rain of food that mostly gets eaten before it ever arrives. So what does an animal do, faced with a life like that? It adapts to feast and famine in the only way that works. When food does arrive, you cannot afford to be picky, and you cannot afford to be slow. You eat everything immediately, as much as you possibly can, because you have no idea when the next meal will come. And whatever energy you take in, you don't burn it carelessly. You store as much as you can, locking it away as fat, building a reserve to carry you through the long, empty stretch until the next scrap falls. That's the strategy that keeps a deep trench scavenger alive. Eat everything, waste nothing, store all you can. Now watch what that survival strategy does when the food is contaminated. Every scrap of marine snow that reaches the bottom might carry a molecule of persistent poison stuck to it. We established that. A shallow water animal in a rich environment might eat a contaminated particle here and there and pass most of the food through without absorbing everything. But the trench amphipod can't afford that. Its whole existence is built around extracting every possible bit of value from every rare meal and storing it. It doesn't get to be selective. It eats the contaminated scrap with the same desperate completeness it eats a clean one, absorbs what it can, and stores the energy as fat. And the poison, remember, is exactly the kind of chemical that dissolves into fat and stays there. Do you see the trap closing? The two survival adaptations that keep this animal alive are the two things that poison it. It eats everything, so it can't avoid the contamination. It stores fat, and the contamination hides in fat. The very features that make it a successful survivor in a starving world make it a perfect vessel for chemicals that hunt fat and never break down. Its strengths are the mechanism of its poisoning. It's not being poisoned despite being well adapted. It's being poisoned because it's well adapted. And this is where the numbers from earlier finally make sense. The ones that showed the animal more contaminated than the water around it. The trench is a sink for the chemicals. But the animal is a sink inside the sink. It takes the contamination that the environment has already concentrated by funneling and collecting it, and it concentrates it a second time inside its own body, gathering the poison from meal after meal into its fatty tissue where none of it ever leaves. The water might carry a faint dose. The animal carries the sum of every faint dose it has ever eaten. That's why you don't test the water. The water is the thin version. The animal is the concentrated version. Now push it one step further, because there's a second concentrating engine on top of the first, and this one runs up the food chain. Not every animal down there is a scavenger eating snow. Some of them eat each other. And when a slightly larger animal eats the amphipods, it doesn't just get their food value, it gets their accumulated poison too. All the contamination those amphipods spent their lives gathering into their fat gets passed up, intact, into the body of whatever ate them. And it stays there, and it adds up meal after meal, the same way it added up in the amphipods. So the predator ends up carrying not just its own exposure, but the combined exposure of everything it has eaten. Eat 100 contaminated amphipods over a lifetime, and you're carrying something close to the poison of 100 contaminated amphipods. This is a process that has a name, and it works everywhere on Earth, but it works with terrible efficiency in a place like this. Each step up the food chain, the contamination doesn't stay level. It climbs, because each predator absorbs the stored poison of many prey and holds onto it. The chemicals ratchet upward through the food web, getting more concentrated at every stage. And in the trench, the food web is short and closed and isolated, with the same limited cast of creatures eating and being eaten in the same sealed environment. No fresh, clean input from outside to dilute anything. A short-sealed food chain in a sink is close to the ideal machine for stacking poison higher and higher with each link. So the trench does its work, and then the food web does its work on top of that. Two concentrating engines running in sequence. The environment gathers the diffuse contamination and funnels it to the bottom. The animals gather it from the environment into their fat, and the predators gather it from the animals, stacking it higher with every step. By the time you measure the tissue of a creature near the top of that little food chain, you're not looking at the pollution of the trench anymore. You're looking at the pollution of the trench multiplied by every living thing that concentrated it on the way up. There's something genuinely dark about this when you follow it all the way through, and it's worth saying clearly. These animals are being punished for being good at surviving. In almost any other context, we'd call this creature a success story, an animal so well adapted to famine, so efficient, so complete in wringing survival out of an impossibly harsh place, that it can live where almost nothing else can. That efficiency is the achievement of millions of years of evolution. And it's exactly that achievement that turns it into a container for our chemical waste. Evolution built the perfect survivor for the trench, and we filled the trench with something that makes the perfect survivor the perfect victim. It also quietly overturns the last comfortable assumption we might have been holding. You could have imagined that even if the trench were contaminated, the animals living there would somehow be tough, resistant, built to handle whatever's down there. That a creature hardy enough to survive that pressure and cold and dark would surely shrug off the poison too. It's the reverse. The hardiness is the vulnerability. The traits that let it endure the physical brutality of the trench are the same traits that make it soak up the chemical contamination. There's no separating them. The animal can't be tough enough to live down there without also being the kind of animal that concentrates poison. Survival and contamination are built from the same biology. So we've now watched the poison travel its whole path, made in a factory, banned and forgotten, clinging to particles and plastic, riding the snow down, funneling into the trench that can never flush it out, and finally gathered, concentrated, and multiplied inside the bodies of the creatures whose only crime was being very, very good at staying alive in the hardest place on Earth. Which raises a question we've circled, but never really faced head-on. We keep talking about this animal, the scavenger, the survivor, the one that carries the evidence, but what actually is it? What kind of creature chooses to live in a lightless, freezing, crushing, starving dead end at the bottom of the world? Because whatever it is, it can't leave. It didn't wander down there by accident and get trapped. It evolved for that place. It belongs to the trench in a way that means it has nowhere else to go. And that, it turns out, is the final sharpest part of what makes its poisoning so complete. Let's actually look at it. Not as a data point, not as a container of poison, but as an animal. Because once you understand what it is, the whole story gets 1 degree colder. Hirundellea gigas, a crustacean, a couple of centimeters long, pale to the point of near translucence, with the curved body and many legs of the amphipod family. If you saw one in a dish, you might mistake it for a small pale shrimp. It has no drama to it, no obvious weaponry, none of the nightmare features we associate with deep-sea creatures. No glowing lures, no needle teeth, no gaping jaws. It's small and plain and, by the standards of the monsters, people expect from the deep, almost disappointing. And it lives at the very bottom of the deepest trench on Earth, in conditions that would destroy nearly anything else alive. Start with the pressure, because it's the thing our bodies can't even imagine. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the weight of 7 miles of water pressing down is beyond anything human instinct can grasp. A crushing force so enormous that unprotected equipment built for shallower depths simply fails. Most of the vehicles humans have ever built cannot go there and return. Your body, taken to that depth unprotected, would not last a moment. And this animal lives there, not visits, lives. Its entire biology is built to function under a load that would flatten almost anything we know. How? This is where it stops being a plain little creature and becomes something quietly astonishing. Surviving that pressure isn't about being armored or tough in the way we picture toughness. A thick shell would just be crushed like everything else. It's about being built, right down to the chemistry of your cells. For a world where the pressure never lets up, the proteins in a body, the membranes that hold cells together, the molecular machinery that keeps a creature running, all of it at that depth is under a squeeze that would jam and deform the equivalent parts in a surface animal. Deep trench life has had to solve that at the smallest scale, evolving cell chemistry that keeps working when everything is being pressed inward. Hirundalea gigas has even been found with adaptations that let it feed on the tough, hard-to-digest material that drifts down into its world, turning the near-inedible scraps of the deep into something it can live on. This is not a simple animal. It's a specialist, tuned by evolution, to a set of conditions so extreme that specialist undersells it. And that word, specialist, is the hinge of everything that follows. Because being that finely tuned to one place means you belong to that place completely. You can't take an animal whose cells are built for crushing pressure and move it up into gentler water. The very adaptations that let it thrive at the bottom would betray it anywhere else. A body engineered for that depth is trapped at that depth. It can't rise. It can't leave. It's not living in the trench the way you live in a city you could move away from. It's living in the trench the way a key lives in one specific lock, shaped so exactly for that one place that it fits nowhere else. This is what I want you to sit with, because it's the detail that makes the poisoning feel less like a fact and more like a sentence. The amphipod cannot escape the contamination even in principle. It's not a matter of the animal not knowing or not trying. There is no version of its life where it swims up out of the polluted trench into cleaner water and starts over. The trench is the only place its body can exist. It evolved for the dead end. It's a creature perfectly adapted to live in exactly the one place on Earth that has become a permanent collecting basin for chemicals that never break down. Its home and its poison are the same location, and it cannot have one without the other. Think about how completely the trap is sealed. The chemicals can't leave the trench because a trench has no outflow, and the animal can't leave the trench because its body only works under that pressure. So you have an indestructible poison and a creature that concentrates it, locked together in a container that neither of them can exit. The poison stays because of physics. The animal stays because of biology. They're stuck with each other, in the dark, forever. There is no current to flush the chemical out, and no evolutionary door for the animal to walk through. Everything about this situation is closed. And here's the part that reframes the animal itself. We keep calling it a scavenger, a survivor, a victim. But from the point of view of a scientist trying to understand the deep sea, it's something else too. It's a witness. It's the only kind of thing that could have told us what was happening down there. You can't easily send instruments to the bottom of the Mariana Trench and leave them for years. You can't watch the contamination accumulate directly. But this animal has been doing exactly that. Sitting at the bottom of the world, eating what falls, storing the chemical record of everything that has drifted down for its entire life. It is a living logbook of the deep. When we finally pulled some up and read what was inside them, we weren't just learning about the amphipods. We were reading the trench's diary written in poison, in the only ink the deep sea keeps. There's a quiet irony in that, and it's not a comfortable one. This creature is so far from us, so deep, so alien, so completely sealed off in a world we can barely reach, and yet it's carrying our fingerprints, chemicals from our factories, our old electrical equipment, our furniture, our banned industrial past, all of it filed away in the fat of an animal that has never been anywhere near a human and never could be. The most isolated creature we know of is intimately contaminated by us. Distance didn't protect it. Nothing protected it. The one place we assumed we could never reach turned out to be the one place everything we make eventually arrives. And the amphipod just keeps doing what it does. It has no way to know that some of what falls is different now. It can't tell a clean scrap from a poisoned one. It goes on eating, storing, surviving, exactly as its ancestors did for millions of years before the first factory was ever built. The contamination doesn't change its behavior at all. It just accumulates silently, inside a creature going about the only life it knows, in the only place it can live, unable to know or leave or refuse. That's what makes it so unsettling. Not cruelty, just a perfect, blameless efficiency, turned into a trap by something happening far above it that it will never perceive. So we've followed this all the way to its living core now. The poison that never dies, the snow that carries it down, the sink that holds it forever, and the animal sealed into that sink by its own biology, concentrating the contamination into its body and recording it for us to find. Every piece of the machine is in place and every piece is closed. But I told you at the very start that this story was worse than pollution, that the banned chemicals were only the beginning. And they are. Because here's the thing about everything we've discussed so far: the PCBs, the old flame retardants, the persistent poisons of the last century. We stopped making most of them. They're the residue of mistakes we've already recognized and tried to correct. They represent a problem from our past, still echoing down into the deep. The trouble is that the deep sea doesn't only collect our old mistakes. It's still collecting. The snow is still falling. And what's riding it down now isn't just the ghost of banned industry. It's something we're still making, still using, still pouring into the ocean every single day. Something newer, in some ways even harder to stop, and already turning up in the guts of the same animals at the bottom of the same trench. We didn't just poison the deep once and learn our lesson. We're doing it again right now with something else. Here's a sentence that should bother you more than any number I've given you so far. We found the first poison, understood it, banned it, watched it settle into the deepest place on Earth. And while we were doing all that, we were already sending the next one down. The banned chemicals we've been talking about are, in a strange way, a closed chapter. Not closed because they're gone. They'll be in that trench essentially forever. But closed because we recognized the mistake. We identified PCBs as dangerous, restricted them, stopped making new ones. Whatever's down there is a legacy, the long shadow of an error we've at least acknowledged. If that were the whole story, it would be a story about the past, reaching into the deep and never letting go. But the snow is still falling, and it's carrying something we haven't banned, haven't stopped, and are producing more of every single year: plastic. When researchers went back to those same deep trench amphipods and looked, they weren't only looking for the old chemicals anymore. They started looking inside the animals for plastic itself. Tiny fragments and fibers, the shredded remains of the material we've built our entire modern world out of. And they found it. In the guts of amphipods from the deepest trenches, including the very deepest, they found plastic. Not near the surface. Not in coastal animals. In the bodies of creatures at the bottom of the world, in the most remote habitat we know, plastic was already there, already inside them. Let that register. We're not talking now about a chemical from the 1960s finally completing a slow journey down. We're talking about a material that's still pouring into the ocean right now, in enormous quantities, every day. And it has already reached the deepest animals on the planet and gotten inside their bodies. The delivery system we spent the last few chapters describing isn't a historical process that already ran its course. It's running now, in real time, with fresh cargo. To feel why this is worse rather than just more, you have to understand what happens to plastic in the ocean. It doesn't biodegrade. It doesn't rot away like organic material. What it does instead is break apart. Sunlight and waves and time shattering it into smaller and smaller pieces, from bottles and bags into fragments, from fragments into particles, from particles into fibers and specks, so small you'd need a microscope to see them. This is what we call microplastic. And crucially, Breaking into smaller pieces isn't the plastic going away. It's the plastic becoming more available. A single bottle is one object an animal probably can't eat. That same bottle broken into 10,000 tiny fragments is 10,000 particles drifting through the water at exactly the size a small animal might swallow. The plastic doesn't disappear. It multiplies into a form that living things can ingest. Now connect it back to the animal we know so well. The trench amphipod eats everything. It's built to, remember, a life of famine means you can't be selective. You take in whatever arrives and sort it out later. So when microplastic particles drift down and mix with the marine snow, the amphipod does exactly what it does with everything else. It eats them. It can't tell a scrap of food from a fragment of plastic that happens to be the same size. Its whole survival strategy, consume everything, waste nothing, turns it into a machine for swallowing plastic it can't digest and can't use. Once again, the animal's greatest strength becomes the mechanism of its harm. The efficiency that keeps it alive is the efficiency that fills it with our waste. And there's the second layer, the one we set up earlier, and it's the reason plastic is so much worse than plastic. Remember that these persistent, water-hating chemicals cling to solid surfaces, and remember that plastic is one of the surfaces they cling to most eagerly. So a fragment of plastic in the ocean isn't just an inert piece of trash drifting down. It's a magnet that gathers those old banned chemicals onto itself, concentrating them on its surface. And then the amphipod eats the plastic and gets a double dose. It gets the plastic, which it can't digest, and it gets the concentrated load of persistent poison the plastic collected on its way down. The plastic is a problem, and it's also a delivery vehicle for the older problem, ferrying both into the animal in a single bite. So we haven't replaced the old poison with a new one. We've added a new one that carries the old one with it. The legacy chemicals ride the fresh plastic into the deepest bodies on Earth, past and present contamination, arriving together in the same swallow. There's a moment in this research that captures the whole thing, and I want to be careful to give you the sense of it honestly, rather than inventing a quote. The scientists who've studied trench contamination for years have made a point that lands hard when you sit with it. We identified the danger of the old persistent chemicals. We did the right thing and phased them out, and it felt like progress. And then, before that problem was anywhere near resolved, we went and created a new global contaminant and sent it into the same places. The relief of having recognized one mistake gets swallowed by the recognition that we simply made another one. We didn't learn the deeper lesson. We learned the specific lesson about specific chemicals and then repeated the general pattern with a different material. This is the part of the story that stops being about a trench and starts being about us. Because the trench isn't doing anything new. The trench has always been a sink, always collected what fell, always kept what it collected. That's not a flaw that appeared recently. It's just what the deepest place on Earth is. What keeps changing is what we hand it. First, it was the banned industrial chemicals. Now it's plastic, carrying those chemicals along for the ride. The trench faithfully collects whatever we produce and lose to the ocean, without judgment, without limit. It's a mirror at the bottom of the world, and what it reflects is whatever we're currently making too much of. And here's the open loop that should keep you uneasy. If the deepest trench was already collecting banned chemicals from decades ago, and is now collecting plastic we're still producing, then the obvious question is, what else? What are we making right now, today, that hasn't been studied yet, that's already riding the snow down into a place we can't retrieve it from? The contamination we know about is only the contamination we thought to look for. The old chemicals we found because we went looking for those specific compounds. The plastic we found because we went looking for plastic. Both times we found it, which raises the uncomfortable likelihood that if we go looking for the next thing, we'll find that too. because everything we've established says the trench doesn't discriminate. The mechanism, persistent substance, clinging to particles, riding the snow, funneling into a dead end that never flushes, doesn't care what the substance is. It'll do the same thing to any durable pollutant we put in the ocean. The banned chemicals and the plastic aren't special cases. They're just the two we've checked. The sink is open for business for whatever comes next, and we're a civilization that keeps inventing new durable things and losing them to the sea. So the banned chemicals were never the whole story. Exactly as I promised. They were the first thing we found in a place designed to collect anything we send it. The plastic is the second thing. And the mechanism that gathered both is still running, still fed, still waiting for whatever we haven't measured yet. Which brings us to a harder question, one that pushes past the chemicals and the plastic entirely. We've been talking about carbon-based pollution, the chemicals of industry, the material of packaging. But there's another category of poison, older, and in some ways more elemental, that behaves by different rules and may be finding its own way into the deep. Not something we invented in a factory, something we dug up, burned, and released. An element that has been quietly cycling through the ocean, and that the deep sea may be collecting in ways we're only starting to understand. Everything we've talked about so far has been something we made. Chemicals synthesized in factories, plastic molded from oil, human inventions, things that didn't exist until we built them. But there's a different kind of poison in this story, and it doesn't come from a factory at all. It comes out of the ground. And it may be finding its own way into the deep, by a slightly different path, obeying the same brutal logic of the sink. I want to be especially careful here because this is the edge of what's well established, and honesty is the whole reason this kind of story is worth telling. What I'm about to describe is an area of active research rather than a closed case, and I'll flag clearly where the ground is solid and where it's still shifting, but the direction it points is unsettling enough that it belongs here. The poison is mercury, and mercury is different from the chemicals we've been discussing in a way that matters. PCBs and plastic are carbon-based, things assembled from the chemistry of the living world, however unnaturally. Mercury is an element. You can't break it down into something harmless because it isn't made of parts you can take apart. It's fundamental, one of the basic building blocks of matter, and it's toxic in its own right, especially to nervous systems. It's the kind of poison that has always existed in small amounts in the natural world, but that we have pulled up and released in enormous extra quantities by digging up and burning things. Coal in particular, sending mercury into the air and the water in amounts the planet never dealt with before. And here's the thread that connects it to everything we've built. Mercury, once it's out in the environment, has a way of getting into a form that living things absorb and store. And once it's in a body, like the persistent chemicals, it tends to accumulate and to climb the food chain, concentrating at each step. That much is well understood and has been for a long time. It's why we're warned about mercury in certain fish. The mercury in a large predatory fish is the stacked up mercury of everything it ate. Same ratchet, same climb up the food web, same principle we watched with the banned chemicals in the trench. The newer, less settled question is whether the deep trenches are doing to mercury what they do to everything else, collecting it, concentrating it, holding it at the bottom. And there's growing scientific attention to exactly this. Research probing whether mercury from human activity at the surface is reaching the Hadal zone, the deepest trenches, and building up there in the sediment and the animals. I want to be honest that the details, how much, by what exact route, how it compares to the banned chemicals, are things scientists are still working out. And I'm not going to hand you a number I can't stand behind. But the underlying logic is hard to argue with, and it's the logic we've spent this whole story establishing. If it's a durable poison, and it gets into the ocean, and it can attach to sinking material or climb the food chain, then the trench is going to collect it. The mechanism doesn't care that mercury is an element rather than a synthetic chemical. The sink collects durable poison. Mercury is durable poison. The rest follows. And this is the point where the whole story quietly widens into something bigger than any single contaminant. Because look at the pattern. We came in worried about one class of banned industrial chemicals. Then we found plastic. Now we're looking at a toxic element that comes from an entirely different source by an entirely different path. 3 different kinds of poison from 3 different origins: old industry, modern packaging, burned fuel, and the trench appears to be collecting all of them. That's the thing to notice. It's not that the trench has a PCB problem, or a plastic problem, or a mercury problem. It's that the trench has a collecting problem. Whatever durable, harmful thing we release into the ocean, the deepest place seems positioned to gather it. That reframes everything we thought we were talking about. We started with a specific shocking fact: banned chemicals, more concentrated in a deep-sea animal than in a polluted river. It was easy to hear that as a story about those specific chemicals, but the chemicals were never really the point. They were the first evidence of a general truth. The trench isn't contaminated by one thing. It's a place that becomes contaminated by anything of the right kind that we put into the sea. The specific poison is almost interchangeable. What's constant is the trap. And a trap that doesn't care what it catches is a far more disturbing thing than a trap set for one target. If the trench only collected one banned chemical, you could imagine the problem is bounded. A single mistake, a single legacy, something with edges. But a place that collects whatever durable poison reaches it has no natural limit to what it can accumulate. Every new toxic thing we invent or release becomes potentially another entry in the trench's ledger. The container has no preference and no ceiling. It just keeps taking whatever fits the pattern, and the pattern is broad, persistent, harmful, able to sink or to climb. That describes an enormous and growing list of the things human civilization produces. So the honest state of our knowledge looks like this: the banned chemicals, solidly established, measured, real, and shockingly high. That's the firm ground this whole story stands on. The plastic, also found, also real, in the deepest animals, an ongoing and current problem. The mercury and the broader question of toxic elements, an active frontier, strongly suggested by the same mechanism that governs everything else, being investigated right now, with the specifics still being pinned down. 3 layers of certainty, from rock solid to actively emerging, and all 3 pointing the same way, toward a deep sea that is far more entangled with human pollution than the idea of a remote, pristine trench ever allowed, which forces the question we've been circling since the very beginning, and can't avoid any longer. We've established that the trench collects poison, that the animals concentrate it, that it climbs their short food chain, and that it seems to collect more kinds of poison than we first realized. So far, we've mostly treated this as something happening down there, sealed in the deep, in a place we can barely reach, involving creatures most people will never see. It's easy to file it away as a curiosity of the abyss, terrible but distant. Someone else's problem, or no one's. But nothing about the deep sea is actually sealed off from the rest of the ocean. That was the first assumption this whole story broke. Down was never a disconnected direction. It was a destination things travel to. And if things can travel down into the trench, the sharper and more uncomfortable question is whether any of it travels back up. Whether the poison that collects at the bottom of the world stays politely at the bottom, or whether the same food web that concentrated it becomes a ladder that carries it back toward the surface, toward larger animals, toward the fish we know, toward, eventually, us. Because a poison trapped forever at the bottom of the sea is a tragedy for the animals down there. A poison that can climb back out is something else entirely. Let's do the thing the whole title has been promising and put the two places side by side. A river, one of the most polluted on Earth, the kind thick with industrial history, the kind nobody would drink from or swim in, and the deepest trench in the ocean, 7 miles down, nowhere near a factory. Measure the banned chemicals in a creature from each, and the creature from the remote trench comes back carrying more. We've circled this fact for the whole story. Now, I want to show you exactly why it's not a fluke, not a trick of measurement, but the only outcome the physics allows. And the answer comes down to a single question we haven't asked directly yet. Not how much poison arrives at each place, how long it stays. That question has a name in the science of water: residence time. How long does a given thing linger in a place before it moves on? And once you start thinking in residence time, the river and the trench stop looking like two dirty places and start looking like opposites. Take the river first. A river is one of the shortest residence places in the natural world. Water enters at the top and leaves at the bottom, always moving, always heading for the sea. Pour a pollutant in, and it doesn't set up permanent residence. It's immediately caught in that flow and carried downstream. Even in a river's estuary, the place where it widens and meets the ocean, the water is in constant motion. River current pushing out, tides pulling in and out twice a day. The whole system being rinsed and flushed on a rhythm that never stops. A molecule of poison dropped into that estuary has a short career there. Days, maybe. Weeks. Then the flushing carries it out into the open ocean, where the sheer volume of water dilutes it toward nothing. The estuary is filthy, yes? But it's filthy the way a busy doorway is dirty. Things track through constantly, and things constantly get swept out. The dirt is real, and the dirt is always leaving. That constant leaving is the thing we never give credit to. A river's pollution is high because the source keeps feeding it, but it never gets to accumulate to its full potential because the flushing is always draining it back down. The flow is a leak in the bucket. You can pour poison in as fast as you like, and the moving water keeps letting it out the bottom. The river is dirty and self-emptying at the same time. Its filth and its cleansing run on the same current. Now the trench. Ask the same question. How long does a molecule stay? And the answer stops being days or weeks and becomes something closer to forever. The water at the bottom of a deep trench is old, cold, still, and cut off from the restless mixing above. There's no current running through to carry things out, because there's nowhere lower for a current to run to. A pollutant that reaches the bottom of the trench isn't passing through on its way somewhere. It has arrived at its destination. Its residence time isn't measured in weeks. On any scale that matters to a human life, it doesn't leave at all. The bucket has no leak. Whatever you pour in, stays in. Put those two residence times next to each other, and the whole paradox dissolves. It was never about which place receives more poison. The river might receive vastly more right at the source, in a constant industrial flood. It doesn't matter. The river can't hold what it receives. The trench receives far less, delivered slowly, a faint dusting on the falling snow. But it keeps every particle of it, and it has been keeping them for decades, adding a little more every single day with nothing ever subtracted. A small input that never leaves will, given enough time, overtake a huge input that's constantly flushed away. That's not intuition. That's arithmetic. A trickle into a sealed container eventually beats a flood through an open one. Here's the reversal that lives inside that arithmetic. And it's the one I want to stick in your head. The river's filth is its mercy. The very thing that makes a river look disgusting, that it's a channel, a flow, water endlessly moving through, is exactly what protects it from becoming as contaminated as it theoretically could. Motion is mercy. The flushing that we might see as the river failing to stay clean is actually the river constantly cleaning itself, exporting its poison before it can pile up. And the trench's stillness, the quiet, the calm, the pristine-looking motionless dark that we imagined as purity is the opposite of mercy. The stillness is the trap. Nothing moving means nothing leaving, means everything staying. The place that looks calmest is the one that forgives nothing. So the two words in the chapter's own logic aren't decoration. A river forgets. It carries its poison downstream and out to sea and moves on. And what entered it last month is already gone, dispersed, diluted into the vastness. A trench remembers. It holds every molecule that ever reached it, files it away in the cold and the dark, and adds it to the growing sum. One place is built to let go. The other is built by nothing more than its shape and its stillness to keep. And this is why more toxic than the most polluted river stops being a headline and becomes a simple description of how the ocean works. We hear that comparison, and our instinct rebels. The remote place beating the industrial place feels wrong, feels like it must be exaggeration, but the instinct is running on the assumption that contamination is about how much dirty stuff goes in. It isn't. It's about how much dirty stuff is present at any given moment, and that's a balance between what arrives and what leaves. The river has a huge arrival and a huge departure, and the departure keeps the level in check. The trench has a small arrival and no departure at all, and with no departure, the level has only one direction it can ever go. Up. Slowly, quietly, permanently up, for as long as anything keeps falling. There's something almost unfair about it when you sit with it. The river gets called polluted, gets photographed, gets pointed at as a symbol of what we've done to the water. And it's the one that's actually flushing itself clean, exporting its burden, refusing to let the poison settle. The trench gets called pristine, gets described as untouched wilderness, gets held up as the last clean place, and it's the one quietly accumulating a permanent record of everything we've made, unable to release a single molecule of it. We named them backward. The dirty-looking one is the one letting go. The clean-looking one is the one that keeps everything forever. And notice what this does to the comfort we might have taken from the trench being remote. Earlier I said remoteness was never protection. Residence time is the sharpest version of why. Being far away didn't stop the poison from arriving. It just made it arrive slowly. And arriving slowly into a place that never flushes is, in the long run, worse than arriving fast into a place that does. Slow delivery plus infinite residence beats fast delivery plus fast flushing, every time, given enough years. The trench had all the time in the world. That was exactly the problem. Remoteness bought it not safety, but the slow, patient, unstoppable accumulation of everything that ever found its way down. So the direct comparison at the heart of the title comes out like this. It's not that the trench is dirtier at the source. It's that the trench cannot forget, and the river cannot help but forget. And over decades, the one that remembers wins. A poisoned river is a wound that keeps bleeding, but also keeps draining. The trench is a wound that closed over everything and sealed it inside. When we measure more banned chemicals in a trench animal than in a river animal, we're not seeing a measurement error or a shocking coincidence. We're seeing the difference between a place that lets its poison leave and a place that has no exit, reading out, finally, in the fat of a small animal at the bottom of the world. But a poison that stays put, however concentrated, is at least contained. It's a horror sealed in the deep. The real question? the one that decides whether any of this reaches beyond those trapped animals, is whether stays put is even true. Does it come back up? That's the question, and I'm going to give you the honest answer, which is more unsettling than a clean yes, and more complicated than a reassuring no. The truth is that scientists are still working out how much of the deep trench contamination moves back toward the surface. And I'm not going to pretend that's settled. But the reasons to worry are built into everything we've already established. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Start with the assumption most people would reach for, the comforting one. You might think, fine, it's terrible for the amphipods, but at least it's stuck down there, 7 miles deep, sealed in a trench that never flushes. Surely that's the one silver lining. The poison is trapped in the most isolated place on Earth, as far from us as anything could possibly be. If it has to be somewhere, isn't the bottom of the Mariana Trench the safest possible place for it to sit? That assumption rests on the idea that the deep sea is disconnected, and that's the very first thing this whole story took apart. Remember how we started? The belief that the trench was sealed, remote, cut off. It isn't. It's connected to everything above it by the constant rain of falling material. Down is not a locked door. Down is a direction things travel, along a route that stays open. And a route that carries things down is not obviously a route that only works one way. Here's the mechanism that should worry you, and it's the same food chain ratchet we've already watched, just pointed in a different direction. The poison in the trench isn't sitting inertly in the mud. A lot of it is in living bodies, in the amphipods, and in whatever eats the amphipods. And life in the ocean doesn't stay politely in its lair. Things eat, get eaten, move, migrate. A fish eats the contaminated scavengers near the bottom. Something larger eats that fish. Each step, the poison climbs and concentrates, exactly as it did on the way to the amphipod. Except now it's climbing not just up the food chain, but potentially up through the water, carried inside the bodies of animals that range higher than the trench floor. The contamination doesn't have to dissolve back into the water and float up on its own. It can ride upward the same way it rode down, inside living things. And this is where the isolation of the trench stops being a comfort and becomes almost irrelevant. Because the ocean's food web isn't a set of sealed floors. It's more like a tangled ladder, with animals at every level connected to the ones above and below by who eats whom. Deep animals get eaten by less deep animals. Migrating creatures move up and down through the water column, feeding in one layer and traveling to another. The connections aren't perfectly mapped. This is genuinely an area where scientists are still learning, and I won't overstate what we know. But the general shape is clear enough. The deep sea feeds into the wider ocean. It always has. The same connection that let poison fall in can, through the movement of living things, let poison climb back out. Now recall what these particular chemicals do to the bodies that carry them, because this is why it climbs back up isn't a neutral fact. These are the persistent poisons that dissolve into fat and never leave, the ones we know cause real harm. The banned chemicals were banned precisely because they're dangerous, linked to serious health effects, capable of disrupting the basic biological machinery of animals that accumulate enough of them. We already know from studies of ocean life elsewhere that these kinds of chemicals build up to alarming levels in large marine predators, the long-lived animals at the top of the food chain that eat and store everything they eat. That's not speculation about the deep. That's established in animals we can see, the same class of chemical, the same accumulation, the same stacking up the food web. The trench is just an extreme and hidden version of a process we already know operates throughout the ocean. So put it together. The poison collects in the deep. It concentrates in the animals there. Those animals connect, through the food web, to larger animals that range higher. And the chemicals involved are exactly the kind that stack up in the bodies of large, long-lived predators, the kind of animals that in some cases humans eat. I'm not going to draw a straight, certain line from a trench amphipod to your dinner plate. I'm not going to trace, because that line isn't proven and I won't invent it. But I also won't pretend the pieces aren't pointing in a direction. The deep sea is not a sealed vault where poison goes to be forgotten. It's part of one connected ocean, and the poison in it is the kind that travels through living bodies and climes. This is the moment the story stops being about a faraway trench and quietly becomes about the whole ocean, and maybe about us. For most of this, it's been possible to hold the contamination at arm's length, a grim curiosity happening to strange creatures in a place we'll never go. That distance was always a little bit of an illusion, and now it collapses. The trench isn't a separate world that got poisoned. It's the deepest part of the same water that covers most of the planet, the same water that grows the fish, the same system we're part of, whether we think about it or not. The poison didn't go somewhere else. It went to the bottom of here. And notice what this does to the comparison in the title, because it sharpens it one final turn. We said the trench beats the river because the river flushes and the trench traps. True, but there's a darker reading now. A river's poison flushes out to the open ocean and spreads. Bad, but diluted, dispersed. The trench's poison concentrates, climbs the food chain, and gets packed into the bodies of exactly the animals most likely to carry it back toward us. The river disperses its poison into weakness. The trench refines its poison into strength, gathering it into high concentrations inside living things. Trapped isn't the same as harmless. Sometimes trapped means concentrated, and concentrated means potent. And potent means it matters more, not less, when something finally carries it out. Let me be clear-eyed about the uncertainty, because it's real, and it's part of the honest picture. We do not have a complete map of how much trench contamination reaches the surface, or how it compares to all the other sources of these chemicals in the ocean, or exactly what it means for human health. Those are open questions, actively being worked on. Anyone who tells you the answer with total confidence is selling you something. But uncertainty cuts both ways. Not knowing that it's a major problem is not the same as knowing that it's safe. And everything we do understand about how these chemicals behave, how they persist, how they climb, how they concentrate, suggests this is not a problem that stays neatly at the bottom. So the seal we imagined was never really there. The deepest, most isolated place on Earth turns out to be connected to the shallowest, most familiar parts of the ocean by the oldest process in the sea. Things eating things, moving, carrying what they've eaten with them. The poison fell into a place we thought was the end of the line. But in a connected ocean, there may be no end of the line. There's just a system, and everything in it is downstream and upstream of everything else. Which means the last assumption left standing, the biggest one, the one underneath all the others, is finally ready to fall. We've spent this entire time treating the deep sea as a place apart, remote, pristine, untouched, the last wilderness. Every piece of this story has chipped at that idea. And it's time to say plainly what the trench actually is, and why the word pristine was wrong from the very beginning. There's a word that's followed us through this entire story, quietly, doing a lot of damage. Pristine. It's the word we reach for when we describe the deep sea. Pristine wilderness, pristine depths, the last pristine place on Earth. It sounds like a compliment. It sounds like something worth protecting. And it's completely, provably wrong. The deepest place on the planet is not pristine. It hasn't been for a long time. And understanding why that word failed us is the key that reframes everything. Pristine means untouched, pure. in its original, unspoiled state, unmarked by human hands. When we call the deep sea pristine, what we really mean is that we assume no one's been there, so nothing we've done could have reached it. The word carries a hidden argument. Remoteness equals purity. If a place is far enough from us, hard enough to reach, then it must still be in the condition it was in before we existed. But we've spent this whole story watching that argument fall apart. The deep sea is remote, yes. Genuinely, extraordinarily remote. Harder to reach than the surface of the moon, in some respects. And it is also thoroughly touched by us. Those two facts sit together, and they're only a contradiction if you believe that being far away is the same as being protected. It isn't. That was the mistake buried inside the word all along. Remoteness kept people out. It never kept our chemicals out. The physical difficulty of reaching the trench applied to our bodies and our vehicles, not to a molecule of banned industrial poison riding a falling flake of marine snow. We couldn't get down there. Our waste could. And it did. So here's the reframe, and it's the one I want you to carry out of this whole story. The trench is not a pristine wilderness. It's an archive. It's a record. Down there in the sediment and in the fat of the animals is a physical log of the industrial age. The chemicals we invented, the materials we mass-produced, the things we burned and buried and thought we'd disposed of. The deep sea has been quietly filing all of it away. You can find, in the body of a creature at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, chemicals that were banned before that creature's whole lineage of recent ancestors was born. The trench holds our history. It's just written in poison instead of ink. Sit with how strange that is. We think of the deep sea as the place least connected to human civilization. And in one sense it is. No cities, no people, no light from anything we've built. But in another sense, it's intimately, chemically connected to us, holding a more complete and permanent record of our industrial output than almost anywhere on the surface. On land, our waste degrades, gets cleaned up, washes away, changes. In the trench, it arrives and stays, preserved by the cold and the dark and the stillness, accumulating into a fixed record that doesn't fade. If some future intelligence wanted to read the chemical signature of 20th and 21st century humanity, one of the best preserved places to look would be the bottom of the deepest ocean trench. That's not a pristine wilderness. That's a filing cabinet. And here's the detail that turns the whole thing over, the micro twist underneath the reframe. We reached the bottom of the trench with our pollution before we ever reached it with ourselves. The banned chemicals were drifting down and accumulating in those depths for decades, while barely any humans had ever physically been to the bottom of the Mariana Trench at all. Think about the order of that. Our waste got there first. By the time a human being was looking at the trench floor, our chemical fingerprint had already been settling into it for a very long time. We contaminated a place before we visited it. We left our mark on the deepest point on Earth before we'd properly set foot there. The pollution was the advance party. We were the ones running late. That inverts the usual story we tell about exploration and impact. We like to imagine it as a sequence. First we go somewhere, then we affect it. We arrive, and our presence changes the place. But the deep sea got the order backward. The impact preceded the presence. The place was already altered by us before we truly arrived to see it, which means there was never a moment when a human being encountered a truly untouched trench, because by the time we could go and look, we'd already been changing it invisibly for years. The pristine deep sea, the untouched version, the one the word promises. We never actually got to meet it. It was gone before we showed up. This is why the word matters, why it's not just semantics. When we call the deep sea pristine, we make it easier to keep doing exactly what caused the problem. Pristine tells us the deep is fine, separate, safe, none of our concern. It lets us keep the out-of-sight, out-of-mind reflex that put the poison there in the first place. The whole reason the trench became a sink is that we treated the ocean as a place things disappear into. Somewhere you can lose your waste and stop thinking about it. Calling the deep pristine is that same reflex wearing nicer clothes. It's the comforting story that lets us not look. And every part of what we now know says that story is false. The deep isn't where our waste disappears. It's where our waste is best preserved. There's something almost humbling in that. And I mean humbling in the uncomfortable sense. We are so used to thinking of the deep sea as beyond us. Too vast, too deep, too alien for our small activities to matter to it. The trench is one of the grandest, most extreme, most indifferent environments on the planet. A place that crushes our machines and ignores our existence. And yet we've marked it. This enormous, ancient, overwhelming place carries the residue of ordinary human industry. Old electrical equipment, discarded furniture foam, shattered plastic, burned fuel. The mismatch is staggering. Something as mundane and forgettable as the flame retardant in a couch has reached the bottom of the deepest trench on Earth and lodged in the body of an animal built to survive pressures that would kill us instantly. The grandest place, marked by the most ordinary waste. That's the actual relationship between us and the deep, and it's nothing like the clean separation the word pristine promised. So we let the word go. The deep sea is not pristine and probably never will be. Again, in any time frame that matters to us, because the things we sent down don't break down and don't leave. What's there is there. The trench is not a wilderness we've failed to reach. It's a record we've already written, in a hand we can't erase, in a place we can barely visit. Remote? Yes. Untouched? No. Those were never the same thing. And believing they were is exactly how the deepest place on Earth ended up more contaminated than a poisoned river. Which leaves one last thing to do. We've dismantled the assumption, traced the mechanism, followed the poison down and possibly back up, and finally named what the trench really is. But there's a final way to see this place. One that pulls all of it together and leaves you looking at the deepest point on Earth differently than you did when we started. Because if the trench is the lowest room in the house, the place everything eventually falls to and never leaves, then it's not really a faraway curiosity at all. It's the bottom of the same world we live at the top of, and everything we make is still, right now, on its way down to it. Picture the light one more time. A single beam in absolute darkness, cutting a narrow cone through black water at the bottom of the world, and inside that cone, the endless drift of marine snow still falling. The way it has been falling for millions of years and is falling right now as you watch this. That image is where we started, and it's where we're going to end, because everything we've learned is contained in it. The snow that feeds the deep. The snow that poisons it. The narrow beam of light that's the only reason we can see any of it at all. Here's the reframe I want to leave you with, the way to see the trench that holds everything together. We've been calling it a sink, a drain, a dead end. Those are accurate. But there's a simpler way to say it. The Mariana Trench is the lowest room in the house. It's the bottom of our world. Not a separate world, not a faraway one, but the deepest floor of the same house we live in. And in any house, the lowest point is where everything eventually settles. Dust finds the low corners. Water finds the drain. Whatever falls, falls down. The trench is just the lowest point on a planet, where the ocean covers most of the floor. And so it is the place, on the entire Earth, where fallen things most reliably come to rest and stay. That's why it matters that it's the deepest. Not because deep is dramatic, though it is. Because deep is final. In a system where everything sinks, the deepest place is the last stop. The point past which there's nowhere left to fall. Every other place in the ocean is somewhere things pass through on their way down. The trench is where the falling stops. It's the bottom of the bottom. And things that reach it have quite literally nowhere else to go. We spent this whole story proving that, mechanism by mechanism, the persistence, the sinking, the funneling, the lack of any outflow. But it comes down to something almost childishly simple. It's the lowest place. Low places collect. This is the lowest place there is. And now hold that against the phrase we started with, the one that sounded like a trick, and turns out to be a plain description. More toxic than the most polluted river. A river is a hallway. Things move through it and out. It's dirty and passing, filthy and flowing. A channel that carries its poison away even as more arrives. The trench is the room at the end of every hallway, the place the flowing finally stops. A river ends at the sea, and the sea in the end has a bottom. And the bottom is here. Everything the rivers carry out, everything the surface sheds, everything that sinks from the whole vast ocean has one lowest place it can ultimately arrive at. The river forgets its poison downstream. The trench remembers all of it forever, because there is no downstream left. That's not hyperbole anymore, is it? Once you understand the mechanism, more toxic than the most polluted river isn't a shocking headline. It's just what happens when you compare a place that flushes to a place that keeps. The surprising part was never that the trench is contaminated. The surprising part is that we ever thought it wouldn't be. That we looked at the lowest, most collecting point on Earth and called it pristine. I want to be honest about the size of what we don't know, because it's the most unsettling part, and it's the truest. Everything we've talked about, all of it, comes from an astonishingly small amount of looking. A handful of expeditions, a few landers dropped into a few trenches, a limited number of animals brought up and measured. That single beam of light in the darkness is not a metaphor. It's close to the literal truth of our knowledge. We have illuminated a few tiny spots at the bottom of a system that is unimaginably vast and almost entirely unobserved. The Mariana Trench alone is enormous, and it's one of many trenches, and the deep sea as a whole is the largest habitat on the planet by far, and we've sampled the barest flecks of it. What we found in those flecks was already enough to overturn the idea of a clean deep sea, which forces the question the darkness never answers. If the little we've looked at is already this contaminated, what's in all the parts we haven't looked at yet? We don't know. That's the honest answer. We don't know how much poison is down there, or how far it's spread, or how much of it is climbing back up through the food web toward us, or what else is riding the snow down right now that we haven't thought to measure. We know the mechanism, and the mechanism is relentless and still running. But the full scale of what it has collected is sitting in darkness we've barely entered. Every new look tends to find more than we expected. That's not a reassuring pattern. And the snow keeps falling. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the fact that makes this a present tense story, and not a historical one. This isn't a problem that happened and finished. Right now, as you're hearing this, marine snow is drifting down through the dark toward the deepest trenches, and some fraction of it is carrying something that will never break down. Old banned chemicals still circulating, plastic we made this year. Whatever else we're releasing that we haven't studied. It's falling now, it'll be falling tomorrow. And each particle that reaches the bottom joins the ones already there, in a place that can't flush, can't degrade, can't cleanse, can't do anything but hold. The level at the bottom of the world has one direction it can go, and it's still going there today, without pause. So here's what I'd ask you to do with all of this. The next time you hear the deepest place on Earth described, the Mariana Trench, the bottom of the ocean, the last unexplored frontier, and the word pristine, or untouched, or remote, comes attached to it. Remember the amphipod. Remember the small, pale scavenger with banned industrial chemicals, soaked into its fat, living in a place it can never leave, eating poison it can't taste, recording a history it can't understand. Remember that remote never meant safe, that depth concentrates instead of protecting, and that the loneliest place we know is intimately marked by the most ordinary things we make. The deep sea isn't the edge of our world, held apart and clean. It's the bottom of it, collecting everything we let fall. The trench was never the pristine wilderness we imagined. It's the one place on Earth that keeps everything, forgets nothing, and can't be cleaned. And it's still down there in the dark, under 7 miles of water, quietly gathering what we send it. One flake of falling snow at a time, for as long as we keep making things that sink and never leave.